In today's episode of the International Risk Podcast, we're going to dig into one of the biggest risks facing governments, businesses, and democracies today. And it's about how disinformation, how disordered information, and how digital media are really reshaping what we trust. They're reshaping our security and they're also reshaping the public debate. Today, I'm joined by Natalie Martin. She's a former BBC News producer and she's now an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham in the School of Politics and International Relations. And she really is examining that intersection of journalism, of disordered information and security and where they come together. And we're also joined by Elliot Higgins. He's the founder of Bellingcat, whose open source investigations have helped really redefine how truth can be uncovered and can be found, especially in this digital age that we live in today. And I'm hoping that we can unpack what happens when information has become yet another battlefield that we have to work through today. Elliot and Natalie, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thanks for having us on.
Now, Elliot, I know some of your recent work, and this is not necessarily new, but something that keeps coming up is about how you're arguing that disinformation, it's not just simply about false or misleading content, but it's about this deeper breakdown. And I think this is what concerns me more, is about this deeper breakdown about how societies understand information and how they verify and whether they verify information. I mean, politicians, they're reacting within hours, which is very, very fast. But we see markets often reacting in minutes. Sometimes they're reacting with silence. Sometimes they're reacting with significant drops or changes in market prices. But social media, that's filling in the gaps within seconds. And we see that. We see that with toxic influencers. We see that with amateur influencers. And we see that with people that have huge followings online. So when we see energy markets, when we see conflict in Iraq have massive fluctuations, is it possible for journalists to still conduct open source investigations to verify information accurately, but fast enough to actually matter? Or are truth-based institutions just too slow today?
I think it's a bit of both, really. So we really need to understand that the whole information kind of system that we've based our democracies around has changed dramatically over the last 15 years at a fundamental level. We've moved from the 20th century model of this top-down, elite-controlled information system where they were the kind of responsible for verifying information, picking what was important enough for the public to see, excluding certain voices, and then that would reach the public as consumers of information. And that would happen over a kind of temporal spacing as well. You'd have the papers printed every day, you'd have the news broadcasts at certain times, you'd listen to the radio. And you only had such a certain amount of information that you could really see, because there was a kind of sparsity of information, but an excess of attention from the public. That's inverted and collapsed, really. So now we have a huge amount of information and not enough attention for any individual to actually look at all of this stuff. And we also have these platforms that are selecting information for us, helping us find our tribes online, and kind of creating a bespoke information environment for everyone. Plus, everything's happening at the speed of light now. You know, as soon as an event happens, there's almost a kind of demand side issue from the public, from the consumer, to expect there to be information about anything that's happening in the world. And that means that there are people online, organizations who are happy to provide that information. But the social media platforms, they reward what gets attention, not what is truthful. And that starts skewing stuff towards the most exaggerated claims, not the most truthful claims. And that means there's certain individuals who can build a big reputation just by publishing stuff that reinforces what people want to hear and believe anyway. And that creates a very poisonous dynamic, I think.
And I think that information system is what is, as I mentioned before, is what concerns me. And Natalie, when we saw a girls' school that was destroyed in Iran recently with just tragic consequences. We see Russia nearly every day attacking civilian infrastructure in the middle of Europe's winter. We see how major crises are just flooded with information. And I think the environment we're in today is information, and all this reporting is no longer just the background noise to the actual events, but it's actually, as I said before, and I'm a little bit cautious about using that word, but it has become a bit of a battlefield. We're at this point where disinformation isn't just a communications problem that our communications teams or us as consumers need to worry about, but it's actually, I worry about its place in enabling escalation, supporting miscalculation, and leading to strategic failure. And we see when we've got people like the Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's deputy, and bit of a pit bull, who loves to talk about nuclear threats. When we've got a Trump administration that really appears to shoot from the hip. We've got a European Union that is often, sadly, largely silent, and then a bunch of other countries that are somewhere in between. What concerns you most when it comes to disinformation and this fight for what's being said and what the real truth is?
Yeah, there's two issues really. There's the first thing is that as Elliot said, there's a lot more information which needs to be verified. And so in mainstream or legacy newsrooms, they are dealing with a lot more information than they used to be. So you're absolutely right. Time is of the essence. But you also have the situation where you have social media, which is presenting information as if it were news. So as if it had been verified. And it hasn't. So that's the problem. So there's almost a lot of literal fake news out there. And part of the issue is, and part of the security jeopardy is, that somehow we have to raise awareness that you have two different systems going on. You have old school journalism, which does usually try and fact check or verify, but then you have information which is presenting itself as if it were old school journalism, or perhaps people are just presuming that the same processes apply to it, but they don't. But they can look very similar, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I certainly think it is, and Natalie, you'll appreciate, certainly with the university students, starting off with a definition. So if you don't mind, if we go down that path for a little bit, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion between terms like misinformation, disinformation, and of course this information disorder. So from your perspective, what really matters?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it is one of my personal bugbears. Disinformation tends to get used as a catch-all term, whereas really it's a specific thing. So this goes back to Claire Wardle and Hussein Derrickshan's definition, which was way back in 2017, of disordered information, which is actually three things. Yeah, so you have disinformation, false information with a malign intent. Then you have misinformation, which is also false information, but maybe inadvertently disseminated. So, someone sharing something on Facebook or Twitter or whatever the social media is now, but believing it to be true, but not realizing it isn't. And then, equally harmful, you have malinformation, which is true information which is spread with a malign intent. And it's important to make that distinction. And that comes under the umbrella of disordered information, which is also sometimes referred to as information disorder. But I think it's important to stick to the Wardle and Derrickshan definition, and make the distinction between what's true and what's false, but also acknowledge that both true and false information can have malign intent and can be used as part of the manipulation that we see. I mean, you mentioned, it's very easy just to look at Russian claims, but a lot of the claims which need to be verified are Russian claims. So, yes, I mean, it's very easy for them to say something. We've also seen that in the last couple of weeks with Donald Trump. Yeah, so the girls' school in Iran said it wasn't an American Tomahawk missile, but everyone, there are good grounds to question that. I'm being polite when I say that. But the problem is his comments will be reported very, very quickly. So it's all about speed, it's about volume. And increasingly, of course, you have AI, which is coming in, which will increase the quality as well as the quantity of potential false information. So, it's a very, very complicated scenario. But there's real jeopardy attached to it.
And so, Natalie, I'd love to ask your opinion. I hope it's okay to ask you this question, but listening to what you talked about then, and especially how we can use truthful, fact based information, but use it and manipulate it in a way that is potentially not healthy. I wonder when you listen to someone like Carolyn Levitt, the White House spokesperson, uh, is she someone that impresses you or scares you? Or I mean, her ability to draw on information and to take nuances, especially when she's taking nuances from the president. I think many people can listen to her and be impressed, not necessarily by what she's saying, but how she uses the available information to the White House's advantage.
To some extent, that is her job, isn't it? I mean, she is just doing her job, and White House press spokespeople have always spun things to the best advantage, and that is their job. You can't blame them for that. I think I'm probably more concerned about client journalists or politicians or even celebrities who are spreading obviously dubious information and presenting it as if it's true. Yes. So I'm actually more concerned about Trump than I would be about his spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I think both you and Elliot have spoken about the media and how that's transforming. And Elliot, I'd love to hear your opinion because in my opinion, and actually on a few recent guests we've had on the International List podcast, we've spoken about how a lot of the media seems to be less like reporting and more like identity performance or about opinion pieces, with these hotter takes and stronger tribes, as you mentioned before, and perhaps less patience or diligence around the nuance of many stories. And I understand that some of this is the commercial model that rewards outrage over accuracy.
Yeah, I think there's several things happening at the same time. And I mean, first of all, the incentive structures that the online platforms produce in terms of what makes engaging news is kind of warping the kind of way people encounter news in the first place. I think sometimes when you're talking about the news and the media, people sometimes forget that a lot of people don't pick up newspapers anymore. They aren't turning on the TV news at 6 or 10 or wherever it's on. They are getting it purely through social media feeds. That means there are then certain personalities who are maybe with traditional news organizations working by themselves, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, who they are seeing the data that they are getting from their audiences when they talk about certain topics, which guests get the most views, and they will that's feedback to them, and that incentivizes them to produce certain kinds of content in a certain way. You also see this for kind of more news influencer type people who aren't really journalists, but they have an audience that they are trusted by. And trust then becomes a really big part of this. And we're certainly seeing, I think, in the US, certain media organizations looking at that and saying, oh, this is the way we have to do news now, that we have to have these personalities who people trust rather than the kind of brand of our kind of news organization being the thing that's trusted.
And Natalie, I can see you nodding for those of our listeners that are just listening to the podcast today. But why is disinformation? Why is this information space that we're talking about? Why is it a structural risk to democracies? I mean, we know, and we've spoken about this a lot on the Internationalist podcast, how over the last 20 years there's been a consistent decline in democracy around the world. But why is this not just a simple of fake news? Why is this actually a structural problem to our political system?
Indeed, yes. I mean, as Eliot says, you have these wider political and economic structural issues which are going on, which then make us more vulnerable to weaponized information. And there are actors out there who are willing to weaponize information. One of them is Russia, but there are many others. So it's not just a foreign policy issue. It's definitely a domestic issue as well. And sometimes there's an overlap between those. Yeah? So domestic actors who are using weaponized information sometimes have foreign influences upon them. So we shouldn't just see this as something which happens elsewhere to be reported on. This is something which is happening here, which is affecting our democracy as well. And when I say here, I mean the United States. I mean, if you take Eliot's VDA structure, I mean, the United States is probably, I think you would agree, Eliot, an example of simulated democracy at this point. Yes, certainly very hollowed out. And even in the UK, we're not there yet, obviously, but it's not a perfect system, and there are a lot of pressures on it from weaponized information. because it's been made vulnerable by the events of the last 25 years or so. So it's a problem, but it's, and it is a problem of foreign policy. Everything that's going on in the world at the moment is being managed information wise, and that is probably to the strategic advantage of Vladimir Putin at the end of the day. But it's also a domestic issue. It's about what's going on in UK politics at the moment and the various complicated machinations of that. A lot of it revolves around information, but I agree we shouldn't just take information or disinformation in isolation. You have to see it in context. It doesn't work unless the structural conditions have made us vulnerable to it.
And I'd love to hear about some of the policy responses, Natalie. But just first, I'll remind our listeners, for those that prefer to watch their podcasts, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please do go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And please do subscribe to our content if you like it. Please also like it and share it with a friend. That really is critical for our success. But Natalie, I'd love to hear about some of the policy responses. So far they've focused on things like fact checking and content moderation of varying levels of quality and platform regulation, again with varying levels of efficacy. Based on your research and based on what you're seeing, are these approaches sufficient? Are they falling short? What do we need to do to move forward in an environment where we can actually feel safe for our children? Now, of course, Australia has banned children under the age of 16 getting on social media. I'd love it if they implemented similar laws in Europe and America. But notwithstanding that, what else needs to be done to try and encourage a more accurate form of media?
Well, the problem you have is that a large part of the issue is social media and transnational digital platforms, and it's very hard to regulate transnational digital platforms. I can talk to what journalism as an industry in the UK has done in response to these issues, because I've done some research on that. What I found was that prior to the COVID, so prior to 2020, so prior to the COVID outbreak, newsrooms in the UK, these national newsrooms, tended to view disinformation as disinformation, not as disordered information, but also as something which happened elsewhere, as I just said. Whereas COVID made them realise that it is something which happens here, and also they themselves are vulnerable to disinformation. So there was a lot of stuff going around during COVID about, you can't trust mainstream media, Bill Gates is trying to vaccinate you with a microchip and all of that kind of stuff, which really brought it home to them that not only was disinformation a risk to their viewers and listeners and readers, it was actually an existential threat to the news media itself. And their response to that has been to bring in more fact checking, but also more of Elliot's stuff, more of the open source investigation. You've had a lot of news outlets adopting open source investigation since 2020. BBC Verify, Financial Times have a unit, Guardian has a unit, Sky News has a unit, and several others as well. Whereas prior to that, they had been fairly slow or late adopters of these techniques, but it kind of brought it home to them. Whether that is a solution, it's possibly a solution to the existential threat to news outlets. Whether it's a solution to the societal threat, probably not. No, for reasons I'm sure Elliot has some views on, but we can discuss further.
And Elliot, you've been doing this for a long time now. You started on the Syria crisis, and through your work at Bellingcat, you've really helped pioneer the use of open source intelligence in verifying events and challenging disinformation, including your VDA framework and structuring how digital evidence is collected and then how it's analysed. Can you talk to us about this and how has this ability to analyze publicly available information and data actually change the balance between the powerful and those that are trying to understand events? And how has this even changed over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's certainly been a big change over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the adoption by institutions and especially mainstream media of open source investigation. As Natalie said, there's been a large number of news organizations who are now doing this work. I think that became most apparent with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where there was a lot of really good open source investigation being done by a lot of outlets. And we're seeing that time and time again with Gaza, now with Iran. So, that's a positive that this kind of more transparent way of investigation is being done. I think, though, there is still the challenge of getting out there at speed. And we recently did investigations into the Rennie Good shooting and the Alex Peretti shootings in Minnesota. And one thing we did there is, as we were doing our investigation, as things were unfolding, stuff was being posted online, we were finding it. We were producing kind of verification kind of objects. We would take a couple of the videos, sync them together, and show the moment clearly where Alex Peretti was disarmed and then shot, and show the sequence of that very clearly in one video. That would then be shared on social media within a couple of hours of the shooting happening, before the narratives have kind of really formed and crystallized. And that would actually inform the ongoing discourse that was happening online. People would take that video, repost it. It became almost kind of like a memeable unit being spread around all these different debates happening on Reddit and X and private forums and stuff like that. So that actually really influenced, I think, the discourse that was happening around it, both in the kind of more traditional public spaces, but in those institutional spaces where lots of journalists follow the work of Bellingcat, so they see that straight away. I mean, very recently we've also looked at the video that showed the Tomahawk missile hitting close to the girls' school in Iran, and we discovered that. We published that again on social media and then did an article on that. And a lot of news organizations first encountered that through the work of Bellingcat. They were able to verify what was in the video themselves. And again, that really influences the discourse around these topics. And you have to be able to quickly get information out there, because it really is kind of engaging with the discourses that's happening, especially when you're dealing with countries who are going to lie. It used to be Russia lying all the time. Now we're dealing with the US lying all the time, but it's the same, it's the same thing in a different hat, basically. So we can spread these ideas and these techniques. And something that's been really useful for us is, getting out there, training these news organizations to do this work. So there's that kind of institutional infrastructure that not only can do it itself, but can also, understand it when they see it as well, and know the difference between good open source investigation and bad open source investigation, and how to check it themselves. But we've also made online spaces for people. We have a Discord server at Bellingcat with 40,000 people. That is a place where, when there are these breaking incidents, you have lots of people bringing stuff together, kind of discussing it, trying to analyze it themselves. And that allows us to really process stuff a lot more quickly than a traditional newsroom would be able to. And then we're able to kind of take that into the Bellingcat editorial process, check it ourselves, and then get it out into the public spaces and forums. So being dynamic and kind of working with the information environment is important. I mean, as bad as this algorithmically mediated space is, it's still the space where everyone's at, and you've got to learn to navigate that space rather than fight against it all the time.
Well, talking about learning to navigate that space, for those of us that are consumers of information, I wonder how realistic it is to expect the wider public, particularly younger audiences, to develop these investigative skills. Now, I need to because of my work. I'm speaking to CEOs and board members and government agencies every day, and they're asking my opinion and asking the opinion of our analysts about events that are occurring and potential outcomes that might come of that. So I deliberately make an effort. I listen to news from the far left, from the center, from the far right. It's actually a little bit amusing when I listen to the same story said 3 different times from different news outlets, to listen to the nuances and the words and what they leave out of stories and what they put in. It's quite an enjoyable activity every morning. But notwithstanding that, most people don't have the time, and most people don't want to listen to the far left and the far right and the center media and try and come up with a balanced view. So, how realistic is it, and what can we be doing to support people to develop these investigative skills on a personal level? And what does that mean for things like media literacy? I mean, Natalie, I assume this is something you speak to your students a lot about. What success are you having, and how realistic is it?
It's easy to teach third-year undergraduate students open source investigation skills because they are keen and they understand the reason for it. I agree. It's a bigger challenge to think about teaching these skills to the wider public and expecting them to take them up. However, I think there is definitely a need for them to be aware that the skills are needed, even if they don't have the skills themselves. So they have to be made aware somehow that the news that they see on social media hasn't been through the same system of checking and verification as the news they see on the BBC. That's essential, and I think that is possible, and possibly is a slight tilt in how these things are working because of BBC Verify and the other units. It is becoming more front of house. So what they've done is bring the sort of backroom processes and make them transparent, put them on screen, yeah? which is good, as long as we haven't gone too far down the road of distrusting all liberal institutions, because that's when you have a real problem. In the UK, we're not quite there yet. We're fine. I'm not so sure about the USA. That is a different scenario, and Elliot's probably better informed about that than me. But in the UK, I think we must make people aware that whilst there is a lot of good information on social media, it's not verified in the same way as mainstream media is. It's really important distinction to make.
I think something that's important there as well is that we need to understand that, as I said before, we have this 20th century model where there was these top-down elite controlled structures where it meant if you wanted to become someone who was influential in terms of the discourse, that usually meant a career path. That you went through school, learnt certain topics, you went to university, you got a job as a journalist or as a political aide, and you worked your way up the ranks until you were in your 30s, and you might be publishing articles or trying to get elected to parliament. Now you just pick up your phone and you're part of the discourse. And you aren't taught your responsibilities to other people in terms of how you interact with information, what it means when you're sharing stuff. And I think that's something that has to be really ingrained in people. The UK's curriculum advice has just been published by the government that says that they want more media literacy skills, and really that's not just about how do you fact check a headline and how do you tell the difference between a good tweet and a bad tweet. It has to be a lot more deeper with that. Fortunately, I'm working with various organizations at the moment who are working on curriculum development who really understand that this can't just be a kind of surface level let's fact check headlines kids, partly because kids don't see headlines anymore, but also they have to understand their responsibility in a modern democracy towards each other. It's kind of like we're moving from the kind of Walter Lippmann model. So Walter Lippmann was a journalist in 1922 who wrote a book called Public Opinion, which explained how public opinion was formed. He said, like an early piece of media studies work. And his solution is that we have a kind of technocratic layer that then kind of tells the politicians what they need to inform the public about and to convince, sell that to the public. And he coined this term manufacturing consent, which Chomsky wrote about in the 80s. But we kind of fell into that system almost accidentally, that this kind of technocratic form of government kind of became more dominant through the second half of the 20th century. But that resulted in democratic hollowing. After that was published, John Dewey wrote a book that kind of said, no, actually, democracy isn't just a form of government; it's a lived experience. It's about how we participate in democracy, and I feel we need to move towards more that way of thinking. How do you make everyone participate in democracy when they're actually already participating in democracy, just with no training or understanding that they're even doing it? And I think that's one of the kind of growing gap that we have between this kind of old institutional focused way of doing democracy that is more along the kind of Lippmann version of it, and having to move towards a kind of more Deweyan version of democracy, a kind of neo-Deweyism, I guess you could call it. But we have to figure out how do we involve people in the democratic process in a way that's healthy for democracy, that creates that substantial form of verification, deliberation, and accountability. But that's not just the responsibility of the public, that's also responsibilities of institutions, first to recognize this, but also be prepared to be constrained by that. Because again, if we want true liberty, it's not about giving everyone everything they want and stripping away all the rules, which the Trumps and Farages and Musks of the world would love to see. It's about saying, how do you create constraints on power? And that still requires those institutions to actually do those substantial accountability roles that I really feel have been hollowed out over the last several decades.
And Natalie, you've been involved also in developing this, and you've been developing one of the UK's first university modules focused on open source investigation. So, what are you teaching students? What are the top 3 or 4 skills that you're teaching them to actually do in practice? And how does this change the way that they engage with information and the media?
The students, we've run this once so far. The next time will be in the autumn of this year. And the students have 11 weeks. They have a fairly heavy grounding in theory, intelligence theory, and security theory. And then they have 3 or 4 weeks of training on open source investigation, facilitated by Bellingcat. And that's geolocation, chronolocation, reverse image searching, and then a few tips and tricks like flight tracking and other things that good open source investigators use. And the students were very, very good at it because a lot of them are they're digitally native. They understand this stuff. Most of them can do quite a lot of it anyway. I don't know if you have daughters, if you have teenage daughters, they are particularly good at using open source investigation to check out their friends and their potential boyfriends. Actually, it was really marked that in the class the girls were really good at this stuff, and they said we do this all the time, and they do. I know that from my personal experience as well. But they understand. They really get the fact that the media has changed and not everything's verified. They were easy to teach. The difficult bit is getting the message out to a wider audience. That's much more difficult. But you have to start somewhere, and that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
You do have to. Yeah, yeah, for sure. You do have to start somewhere. And Elliot, this talking about starting somewhere. When you look back at Bellingcat's work, and it certainly has an impressive history, is there one investigation, or is there one piece of work that you're particularly proud of?
During the COVID lockdown, I was contacted by an organization called Dog Lost, which is an organization that helps people find their lost dogs. And during the lockdown, because there was a high demand for pets, there was a lot of pet theft going on. People would take their dog for a walk, so would steal the dog and drive off with it. And they contacted me because they had CCTV footage of one of these cars driving away, and the number plate was very blurry in it and hard to see. And they asked if we could help, and I thought, well, maybe we can. So I contacted someone I've been working with, a guy called Timmy Allen, who he's really into kind of machine learning and AI and 3D modeling. And he had actually, during an investigation into the murder of a Russian journalist in Ukraine called Pavel Shermat, used a machine learning software he had developed himself to decipher blurry number plates, because that was one of the things that came up in this investigation. So he could actually apply that same piece of machine learning to this blurry dog napping number plate. And it gave us a couple of different possibilities, and we were able to match one using an MOT database to the same make of model in the car in the video. They then passed that on to the police, who don't care about stolen dogs whatsoever. And they said, okay, we'll go and have a check at the address this registered to. They went there, the dog was in the garden, and within 24 hours, the dog had been returned to people. But the reason I like that, I know it's not like a world-changing thing, but it shows that open source investigation can be applied to at wholly different levels. It can be a huge international investigation. It can be something that's really personal about someone's stolen dog, but using techniques that we use to hunt down the murder of a journalist. And for me, it really shows that anyone can be involved with this, that you don't have to be someone who cares about chemical weapons attacks in Syria or schools being bombed in Iran. It can be something that's happening on your street in your own life that you can apply these techniques to and still find a form of accountability. And I just imagine if that was, not just, one stolen dog, but 1,000 stolen dogs or 1 million people doing it, the scale of that could be hugely beneficial, I think, to society and to our democracy. And that's why such a big part of our work is training people to do this, making these skills available, building communities, doing work with universities, and getting as much of these skills out there as possible. Because it's not just about what Bellingcat can do; it's what the people who have these skills can do by themselves and as part of communities.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. These skills are useful at multiple levels. And Natalie, I wonder, when you look around the world, what are the international risks that do concern you the most?
I think there is a big audience for local media as well in the UK to use open source intelligence, which, to my knowledge, they don't do at the moment. And as Elliot has quite correctly outlined, it's as applicable to local stories as it is to big international stories involving human rights. It's across the board, and it's important, and it is empowering, I think, potentially empowering for local communities to have these skills in order to apply them in their local settings. And that could be another way of starting to counteract sort of top-down toxic effects of too much unverified information that we are seeing.
Thanks for explaining that, Natalie. And Elliot, it's a question we ask all of our guests on the Internationalist podcast. So, what are the international risks that concern you?
Well, I think my real fear is that the current information environment tends to reward communities that are conspiratorial, populist, and authoritarian in nature because they offer certainty. They don't have to fact check stuff. They just say it and it's out there and people believe it. It gives a sense of belonging. And those communities are also highly compatible with each other. So on the international stage, it means we'll see more things like the kind of formation of the MAGA movement around these populist, conspiratorial, and authoritarian ideas. We're seeing that with reform in the UK, where they're flirting a lot with conspiratorial ideas. And if you look at populist movements across the world at the moment, there are those same elements that are emerging. And our entire information system is basically really fruitful for those kinds of organizations to form and to cooperate and to find each other. And we are just not doing anything whatsoever to really deal with this. We aren't going to fact check our way out of this crisis. We need much more substantial efforts. We need to recognize that this isn't just something that we can have, teach kids one class a term about how to fact check headlines to fix this. We need a much more deeper understanding of the infrastructural changes and to respond to that, not just hope things go back to how they used to be, because that's not going to happen.
Thanks very much for explaining that. And thank you very much, Natalie and Elliot, for coming on the Internationalist podcast today.